Grief metaphors or illustrations or analogies can really help us feel not only seen in our experience, but have language or like a good enough side by side to explain to other people what it is that we're feeling, what it is that we're going through. It like takes the pain of grief and alchemizes it into pictures, into imagery, sometimes also into words. It gives the experience of grief, which can be kind of like blobby or foggy, a sort of shape or texture or meaning in a time where it can feel like grief is impossible to grasp. Hi there, Grief Growers, and welcome back to Grief Grower. I am so delighted to be here with you today, as always, because we're going to be talking about art. Many of you probably don't know that I majored in communications in college, but I double minored in fine art and psychology, and so thinking about the ways that we doodle grief or illustrate grief is something that I love talking about, and we are going to get into it on today's show. If you have been growing alongside me in my work for a while, welcome back, and if you are new to me and my work, hello. My name is Shelby Forsythia. I am a grief coach and an author and the founder of Life After Loss Academy, which is an online course and community that has helped thousands of grieving people stop feeling lost, stuck, trapped, and overwhelmed, and start building lives that they genuinely love from the lives that loss forced them to live. This includes not only death-related losses, but also things like divorce and breakup, major diagnosis, and any other loss or transformation that changes your life. Here on Grief Grower, we believe that grief is not something to get over. It is something that we grow with and alongside for the rest of our lives, and that when we stop seeing our grief as a problem to be solved and more like an experience to be had, we can create rich and meaningful lives from the losses that we faced, but also with the awareness that it is a precious thing to be alive and to carry everything that we have been through with us throughout the rest of our lives. Like I said at the top of the show, we are going to be talking about 6 powerful grief metaphors that help you make sense of life after loss. These are some of my favorite illustrations, metaphors, analogies that help you put language and words to what it's like to be a grieving person, because grief is often too big or too complex or too layered for just like plain language. For example, you might say something like, I miss my person, but you might actually mean, I'm trying to figure out how to live without my person and carry them with me without feeling weighed down by pain. You might say something like, I'm not sure how I feel. Somebody asks, how are you? I don't know. But you might mean something like, I'm trying to rebuild from a life that lost destroyed and everything feels weird and different and alien. That's a hard thing to put into words. Or you might say something like, I'm having a hard day today, which is a common response to how are you? But you might mean something like, I saw my person's favorite cereal in the grocery store today and it is agonizing to not have a reason to buy it anymore. And when we struggle to say kind of these secondary things, the things under the things, the sentences under the sentences, things like grief metaphors or illustrations or analogies can really help us feel not only seen in our experience, but have language or like a good enough side by side to explain to other people what it is that we're feeling, what it is that we're going through. And of course, no grief metaphor can solve the pain of grief. Instead, it like takes the pain of grief and alchemizes it into pictures, into imagery, sometimes also into words. It gives the experience of grief, which can be kind of like blobby or foggy, a sort of shape or texture or meaning in a time where it can feel like grief is impossible to grasp, whether it's like invisible or it's so overwhelming that you can't possibly wrap your arms around it. And so today on the show, I want to go through 6 of my all-time favorite metaphors for grief, including one that I created, that can help you make sense of life after loss. And if you are grieving alongside somebody who wants to understand grief better, I encourage you to send them this episode along with the number that is your favorite so they can listen along with you too. Okay, first, I'm going to talk about what is probably the most popular grief metaphor of all time, and this is called the ball in the box. This was popularized by Lauren Herschel in 2017 when this Canadian woman on Twitter, Lauren Herschel, shared an illustration of something that her doctor told her about how the pain of life after loss worked. And she wrote a series of like little illustrations. She's like, I'm not an artist, but here's the best way I can doodle it for you. And with each doodle, she wrote the following captions. So she says, grief is like this. There's a box with a ball in it and a pain button in the box. In the beginning, the grief ball is huge. You cannot move the box without the ball hitting the pain button. It rattles around on its own in there, and it hits this pain button over and over and over again. You can't control it. It just keeps hurting. Sometimes the pain seems unrelenting. Over time in life with grief, the ball gets smaller. It hits the button less and less, but when it does, it hurts just as much as it did on day one. It's better because you can function day to day more easily, but the downside is that the ball randomly hits that button when you least expect it. For most people, she says, the ball never really goes away. It might hit less and less, and you might have more time to recover between painful hits, unlike when the ball was still giant. I thought this was the best description of grief I had heard in a long time. And when she posted this tweet, she's just a random lady from Canada, as far as I can see in my research, this tweet went super mega viral. It resonated with thousands and thousands of people, including therapists and grief educators, because it is so visually clear and so emotionally accurate. And she even wrote in a follow-up tweet to her original thread of tweets about how she's using the ball in the box analogy to talk about grief with her stepdad, who is also grieving. So she wrote, he says he now uses it to talk about how he's feeling. Quote, he said the other day, the ball was really big today. It wouldn't lay off the pain button. I hope it gets smaller soon. And so if you're struggling to talk about how pain is showing up in your grief experience or how your heart is feeling today, this is a wonderful metaphor that validates that grief is nonlinear. The ball is not always within your control. Whether or not or how often pain arrives is not always within your control. And moments that hurt or sneak attacks, what sometimes I've heard called grief bombs, are not things that are your fault or things that mean that you're sliding backwards in your grief. They're not setbacks. They are literally just the ball of grief in the box hitting that pain button again. And as with all of these metaphors, if you want to find or see the illustrations for each of these, you can find them on my blog, shelbyforsythia.com/blog, and I will put a link to this specific blog post in the show notes for this episode, so you can go see illustrations of what these are all like. I'm using my hands here on YouTube to do some illustrations, but if you'd actually like to see the doodles of each of these illustrations, you can find them on my website, on my blog. Okay, let's get to number 2, and this is actually one that I put into, I believe, my second book, my third book, one of my books. There is a model of grief called Growing Around Grief, and this was originally created in 1996 by Lois Tonkin, and it challenges the common belief that grief shrinks over time, and instead suggests that nope, grief's the same size, but your life, the thing that surrounds the grief, is the thing that's growing. And so it appears from the outside like grief's getting smaller, but what's actually happening is that your life is growing around the grief. And Lois Tonkin invented this illustration after speaking with a grieving mother. She sketched 2 circles, one that showed grief gradually overwhelming life. Grief metaphors or illustrations or analogies can really help us feel not only seen in our experience, but have language or like a good enough side-by-side to explain to other people what it is that we're feeling, what it is that we're going through. And of course, no grief metaphor can solve the pain of grief. Instead, it takes the pain of grief and alchemizes it into pictures, into imagery, sometimes also into words. It gives the experience of grief, which can be kind of like blobby or foggy, a sort of shape or texture or meaning in a time where it can feel like grief is impossible to grasp, whether it's invisible or it's so overwhelming that you can't possibly wrap your arms around it. And the other that showed life expanding around a grief that stayed the same size, grief that was still present throughout the rest of this person's life. And Lois Tonkin's model has been illustrated countless times online. One of my personal favorites is a bookshelf version by the artist Cherie Alti, and it shows grief as one big fat black book in the middle of a bookshelf. And over time, the bookshelf slowly fills up with other volumes, other texts, other life experiences. And so what looks like an empty bookshelf with just grief in it at day 1 of grief, by day 1934, grief is surrounded by all these other life experiences, and it's such a great interpretation of how our lives can become fuller and richer after loss. The Grow Around Grief model helps you release this pressure to move on or let go of grief, or the pressure to make grief somehow smaller to fit into your life. You do not have to try to fit grief into your life. Well, your life will expand to grow around the grief. It is a reminder that you don't somehow magically outgrow grief, and you are not in control of how much grief will shrink. It is a recognition that, yeah, your grief's going to stay the same size. It is you and your life and the bigness of all that you are and all that you still have left to live that will expand around grief. And so it will not be or feel as big as it is or feels right now. The next one I want to cover is called ring theory. Number 3, the ring theory of grief support, which basically can be summarized as comfort in, dump out. And this is created by Susan Silk and Barry Goldman. So in 2013, the LA Times published an opinion piece called How Not to Say the Wrong Thing, and it was written by Susan Silk and Barry Goldman. It introduced this concept called ring theory for supporting someone going through grief or crisis. So basically, this is not necessarily a metaphor illustration for grieving people. It's for all the people surrounding a grieving person. So this is a great one to share with someone in your pun intended circle who is supporting you through grief but may not understand emotional or relational boundaries. And it goes like this. Basically, if you imagine concentric circles, the center of the circle is the person most directly impacted by the crisis or loss. This is the griever. The next ring includes immediate family or close friends. The outer ring holds acquaintances, coworkers, distant connections, and the outermost ring often includes people that you don't see very often. So like healthcare professionals, people who are supportive, but maybe on the far, far outskirts, also observers or onlookers. And so the rule of ring theory is that only comfort can go towards the center of the circle, and dumping or emotional releasing goes towards the outward rings of the circle. You support people in rings that are closer to the center than you, and you seek your own support. You go get help and resources or dump emotionally on people from rings further out from your own. To put this into clearer perspective, it is inappropriate, for instance, for a cancer patient's coworker to look to the cancer patient, the person who's sick, for emotional support regarding their cancer diagnosis. That coworker should not look at the cancer patient and say something like, "It tears me up so much to see you hurting like this," because what's the cancer patient supposed to do with that? That coworker should lean out for support from other coworkers, their own circle of family and friends, helping professionals potentially that have no connection to this cancer patient. So instead, decompressing with a social worker about how hard it was to see their coworker friend this way, or with another coworker of like, "Man, it's really hard to see her like this. I'm struggling to cope with that," as opposed to dumping that emotional burden on top of the person who is going through the hard thing. Again, this metaphor is less about how to survive the pain of loss and more about how other people should respond to it. This is what Susan and Barry said in their article for the Los Angeles Times. Quote, "The person in the center ring can say anything she wants to anyone anywhere. She can kvetch and complain and whine and moan and curse the heavens and say life is unfair and why me. That is the one payoff of being in the center ring. Everyone else can say those things too, but only to people in larger rings. When you are talking to a person in a ring that is smaller than yours, i.e. closer to the center of crisis, the goal is to help. Listening is often more helpful than talking, but if you're going to open your mouth, ask yourself if what you're about to say is to provide comfort and support, and if it isn't, don't say it. Don't, for example, give advice. People who are suffering from trauma do not need advice. They need comfort and support. So say, 'I'm so sorry,' or 'this must be really hard for you,' or 'can I bring you a pot roast?' Don't say, 'Well, you should hear what happened to me, or my cousin, or my friend's nephew. Here's what I would do if I were you,' and definitely don't say, 'This is really bringing me down to see you like this.' If you want to scream or cry or complain, if you want to tell someone how shocked you are or how icky you feel or whine about how it reminds you of all the terrible things that have happened to you lately, that's fine. It's a perfectly normal human response. Just do it to someone in a bigger ring. Comfort in, dump out." End quote from the article. And this is such a helpful metaphor and illustration for grief, not necessarily for the grieving person at the center, but to kind of set up emotional relations and emotional boundaries with everyone involved in a loss or crisis situation. Because as we've said here before on Grief Grower, grief never happens in a vacuum. You are never doing grief by yourself. We are always doing grief in relationship with other people. And it makes it so that grieving people, potentially you, do not have to manage others' emotions or expectations, and supporters know where and how to offer comfort instead of unhelpful advice or emotional unloading. And they go on to say in that LA Times article that somebody that they spoke to about ring theory has actually drawn her own life ring and has it pinned to the fridge. So she's like, here's me in the center, the person with the grief experiences. Here's my close friends and family. Here's the next kind of closest friends and family. Here's coworkers. Here's acquaintances. Here's onlookers and observers. And she uses it as a guide and will often pull it up in conversations with people to be like, here's where you are in the ring. I, as the person in the center, get to have support from you. You, as someone who is not in the center of the circle, need to find support from somewhere else. Do not look to me, the person who is grieving, as your center of support or as your sole source of support in this experience. And it just makes things clear. And kindness is clarity. Clarity is kind. Alrighty, let's get to number 4, which is kind of a silly one, but one that actually a client brought up with me, and then I found out it was a real thing that existed on the internet. So during COVID in 2020, I was working with a client who was grieving, and she talked about how integrating loss, folding loss into her life was a lot like adding a really unpleasant ingredient to a larger recipe. So for instance, a lot of baking recipes will call for things like apple cider vinegar or a lot of salt or some other type of ingredient that is seemingly in an enormous quantity that wouldn't be good by itself. Like you can't just have a meal that's just salt or just vinegar, but to fold it in with everything else and to have it be reacting to other things in the recipe, gradually it becomes integrated and the end result is something that is beautiful or satisfying to eat. And there is a metaphor going around that originated, I believe, on Instagram by the illustrator Ruth Chan called grief butter. And it's grief as butter in pastry. Now, I don't know about you, but I would eat butter straight. So butter and vinegar are not the same thing to me. But she compared grief as butter that gradually gets integrated into pastry dough and then becomes something else over time. And Ruth Chan created this after a series of personal losses, including the death of her friend Steve. And it was a simple but stunning visual comparing grief to the presence of butter, a lot of butter, in laminated pastry dough. And Ruth wrote in her comic, quote, "Grief from loss is like the butter in a puff pastry. It's huge and imposing and seemingly impenetrable, but eventually gets folded in. It's never gone, but instead infiltrates every part, until one day it is simply part of you in a way that feels okay." And this metaphor is helpful because it's tasty, it's related to a food that a lot of people like, it's relatable, and it reframes grief as something that gets integrated. It's not something that gets removed or separated out from who you are, but it is literally baked into your being like a croissant. It is always there, and it shapes the texture and the taste, the flavor of your life, even when you can't see the butter directly, because you don't pick up a croissant and be like, man, I can see the butter. You can't see the butter, that's the point. It gets so folded in that it becomes invisible in the larger pastry, but you know that it's there because when you put it in your mouth, you can taste it. It is part of the experience of eating a croissant. And in this blog, again, I'll link it in the show notes for this episode if you want to see the illustration to it, you can see her original Instagram post where she talked about grief butter. And just recently, I think like 2023, 2024, she also did a follow-up one that features a chocolate croissant. So you can see how this metaphor has evolved over time, and it's been featured in quite a few places. So thank you to that client who brought the grief butter metaphor to me, and to Ruth Chan for creating this grief metaphor. Number 5 is from one of my favorite grief authors whose book I have. It might be on my shelf back here somewhere. Yes, it sure is. So the author Mari Andrew, she's also an illustrator. She's written a book called My Inner Sky. She also, one of her first books that came out was called Am I There Yet? And it was about the zigzagging path to adulthood. But she writes and illustrates these beautiful essays about life with grief and especially about the death of her father. And in 2018, I believe this was around the time her first book was coming out, Am I There Yet? She created a doodle about grief, and it's kind of grief in 3 parts. And it showed the weight of grief diminishing over time. So first, grief was a huge, heavy, clunky, bulgy burlap sack. And it was scratchy and weird and hard to carry. And then she shows grief as a briefcase, still heavy, easier to move around in the world with. And then eventually grief as a purse. It's still there and it's still important and you still carry it with you, but it doesn't weigh you down the way before. It's not grief in burlap sack mode. And it It is intended to describe how the burden of grief or the weight of grief transforms over time but never necessarily goes away. And in 2022, Mari Andrews shared this illustration again in a Substack piece that she wrote about the 7-year death anniversary of her father. The name of the piece is called Grief Baby. Again, if you go to my blog, you can read it in full. But she writes, Jumana and I talk from time to time about our grief babies. I can't remember where we got that term, but we're referring to the length of time since our respective parents died, acknowledging their absence as a presence. I still vividly remember my grief's newborn stage, when I was sleep-deprived and had no idea what I was doing. Something was screaming at me most hours of the day, and I was completely ill-equipped to understand its wants and needs. After all, I'd never done this before. I love this idea of seeing grief as a grief baby, and then it grows up with you. When a year passed, I felt a significant internal shift that I misinterpreted as the end of grief. All done, I thought, only to find that the next morning I woke up with a 1-year-old who still needed my attention. If we rethink of grief as a living, growing thing with a heart and mind of its own, then we can more wholly accept its whims, its mood swings, its occasional vacations away, and its inevitable returns, often when we least expect it. Grief, you're doing it wrong, is how I felt so many times during those first confusing years when I hadn't a clue how to settle this mysterious toddler's tantrums. Just like dealing with a 2-year-old, nothing about the grief baby's temperament followed any logic. The grief baby has gotten a lot more complex through the years. Tidy answers are not going to work on a now 7-year-old, a child that age starts questioning the Easter Bunny and demanding a few more answers after, because I told you so. This 7-year-old grief baby is skeptical. No one has any way of knowing any of that. But my 7-year-old grief baby is also imaginative. If there are no answers here, then I can make this experience all my own. I can traipse around New York alongside my dad's ghost and envision that we are having coffee and in a completely different relationship at his old haunt in the West Village. I can get upset while waiting for the subway, let the pain swoosh me around like a gust from the train. I can use this death anniversary to be sweet to myself, or I can use it to listen to his music at full blast, or I can use it to really, really feel sad. I can live the questions of grief as Rilke instructs, and children do naturally, rather than force a solution. And I just love her continued musings on grief and loss, seeing grief as a burlap sack and then a briefcase and then a purse, or grief as a grief baby. And this sack to purse illustration helps visualize grief's changing nature as you navigate life. It will always be a container for what you lost. It will always exist, but your relationship to it and the weight that you feel from it and your ability to carry it and what it looks like to others may become more manageable or familiar, or as she writes, more imaginative over time. And I don't know about you, but especially in the early days of my grief, my newborn grief days, that's something that brought me a lot of hope, is it will not always be a giant, scratchy, heavy burlap sack forever. Okay, number 6, the last one I want to gift you today, is grief as a dressing room. And this is one that I personally created and then I share first inside my book, Permission to Grieve, and then also now I teach it often inside of my online course, Life After Loss Academy. So in Permission to Grieve, my very first self-published book, I published it in 2019, I use this metaphor of grief as a dressing room to describe how our identity shifts and changes after loss. When you experience a death or breakup or a major diagnosis, your sense of identity, who am I, who do others perceive me as, is something that is flipped over, upended, gone, dust in the wind. Who you were may no longer feel accessible to you, but also who you are becoming might feel unknown, TBD, life in progress, not really sure what's happening there. Status pending. This is why I started to see, after my mom's death, grief as a dressing room, a private space where you try on beliefs, routines, boundaries, coping tools, identities, ways of being to see what fits now in your life after loss. Because some identities, even ones that you may have held before, feel completely wrong. That is not a good fit. Some identities that do fit are surprises to you. That didn't fit before. I can't believe that fits now. Some identities you keep for a season and then discard or replace later. And all of these things are part of rebuilding your life after loss and learning how to live in this new version of yourself. Whether you chose this for yourself, you instigated a loss, such as a breakup or a move, or you did not choose this loss, such as a death. Again, sometimes we do not choose breakups, or a diagnosis that has changed your life. And this is the passage from Permission to Grieve. Try imagining your identities as articles of clothing in a dressing room. Perhaps caregiver is a purple sweatshirt, creative is a pair of bedazzled jeans, and reliable is a cozy pair of gray sandals. These identities make up a part of how you show up in the world, but they are not you. You can try them on, keepers, hang them up on the rack as possibilities for later, maybes, or give them back to the dressing room attendant, definite no's. Grief forces you to outgrow old identities. Maybe caregiver no longer fits. Maybe creative is temporarily out of stock. Maybe reliable has a bunch of holes in it, making it unwearable in this season. Loss makes it so that some of your identities will never fit again, for instance, religious or innocent, but most of the time your former identities just aren't appropriate to wear right now. I can't tell you how many of my former identities I've rediscovered in the past few years that suit me again. It was like I needed to wait for life's dressing room attendant to get my size back in stock, or, what's even more fun, realizing that my old identity of creativity is no longer a pair of bedazzled jeans, but now, boom, it's a colorful green hat. Where did that come from? I had been looking for creativity in its old form, how I used to recognize it, except loss made my old form of creativity unavailable. It didn't fit me anymore, but it turns out creativity still does exist. It just fits me differently now than it used to because loss has changed my life. So what do you do if you don't know what identity to wear? Start with what you know for sure. This could be as simple as your name, height, eye color, age, or geographic location. Then expand to other definite identities in your life. Is your job title the same? What about your role in your household? Are there community or volunteer roles that align with who you are now? These are garments you are still wearing. What about hobbies, talents, spiritual pursuits? These identities all might feel small in the grand scheme of things. They may just be a small percentage of what you are allowed to keep after loss took so much from you. But know, too, that it is okay, if you got a whole lot of nothing, to wear a bathrobe that has big bold letters spelling out "I don't know" across the back. This outfit will not be your forever attire, but if "I don't know" is a true identity for you, then that's the identity you have permission to wear right now. And that is the section from my first book, Permission to Grieve. This metaphor of grief as a dressing room is so incredibly helpful because it makes room for all of this unpleasant uncertainty, but also so much of the experimentation and the trial and error that we participate in, a lot of times involuntarily, in life after loss. And it tells the truth. Rebuilding is not linear. It is a try on, discard, see if it fits for a while, maybe go back to an old identity, see if that still fits. It's not the same as it was before, and it's always changing. Life after loss is always changing. And while you cannot always choose what identities are in stock in this metaphorical store, you have the power to try out identities or practices you do have control over as you figure out what fits you, how you clothe yourself in identity in life after loss. Something I just love about metaphors is that they help us understand grief in a new way. So whether you are just trying to relate to yourself in grief, because we can become unrecognizable and incommunicable to ourselves, we're like, what am I saying? What am I doing? What am I thinking? And metaphors can help you connect with yourself. Metaphors can also help us connect with other people who are trying to understand us better in life after loss. So to say, that ball is punching that pain button real big today, or to say, I'm still trying to figure out where this giant heap of grief butter goes, that's a great way to start to connect with other people who are trying to understand you in life after loss. And again, as I said at the beginning of this episode, metaphors are not intended to fix your grief or to make it so that pain does not exist anymore. They are intended and here to validate you. Whether that's helping you name something that was previously unnameable to you, or giving you a visual illustration of something that you feel but haven't put words or imagery to, or just offering you this much more clarity in a world that has been blown apart by loss. It helps you make that much more sense out of an experience that is so nonsense making and so incredibly illogical. So if one of these metaphors gave you language or visual for your grief experience, I do hope that you take it with you beyond the audio sound waves of this show. And of course, please share it with a friend, especially if there's a metaphor you're like, let's use this as our secret code, as our language going forward. That would be so incredibly cool to have with you, whether it's the dressing room, whether it's the ball in the box, whether it's the grief growing theory that happens where grief is the same, but life grows around it, or grief as butter that gets integrated gradually as you go along. They are all incredibly helpful. And last thing before we go, if you would like even more helpful frameworks and metaphors and tools and illustrations for coping with grief, you are always welcome to join us in Life After Loss Academy, which is my online course and community for grieving people. Inside Life After Loss Academy, we talk about grief as a record player, we talk about grief as a living thing, we talk about grief as a sitcom, and we talk about grief as a fortune cookie. So if you'd like to hear all of those different metaphors for grief that I invented, you can come visit us in Life After Loss Academy, and we keep doing our best to wrap language and pictures and illustrations and metaphors around what it means to grieve so it is more understandable to us, because when we understand it more, when we relate to it more, we start to be able to get through it just a little bit better. Inside Life After Loss Academy, you get instant access to a video library of short, step-by-step lessons. They're all about 5 minutes or less for navigating life after loss, plus weekly group calls with me. And the replays from the group calls are available immediately if you can't attend live. That's the number one question I get is, what if I can't attend live? You can watch the replay. It goes up right after the call ends, and you can cancel your membership at any time. So the power of whether or not you are in this group, how long you stay, how much you're paying for it, all of that is within your control. And here is one of my favorite reviews from a Life After Loss Academy student, and this relates exactly to what we're talking about today, about finding words to express grief. She wrote, "Throughout this course, I have definitely managed to process a lot of feelings I didn't have words for before. It has been immensely helpful to work through some of those unnameable things, and I have come to feel a lot of relief in that." So, if you'd like to find words for some of your unnameable things in Life After Loss, you can join anytime. You can find the link in the show notes. The course is open year-round, and if you'd like a free taster of how the course works and a preview of what you'll get inside, you can always watch the free workshop for Life After Loss Academy, which is available on my website, and I will put that in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for joining me today here on Grief Grower. I would love to know, what is your favorite grief metaphor? And if there is one I didn't mention, please email it to me. I would love to hear from you. And maybe we'll do a part 2 on helpful grief metaphors for understanding and putting words to life after loss. That's all for this episode of Grief Grower. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you're looking for support beyond this show, you can find my free workshop for Life After Loss Academy, blog articles, and my signature What's Your Grief Support Style quiz at shelbyforsythia.com/links. If this podcast felt validating, comforting, educational, or otherwise helpful to you, please subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And be sure to share Grief Grower with a friend, because you never know what someone you love is going through. Grief Grower is hosted by me, Shelby Forsythia, and our theme music is composed by our very own Addie Goldstein. Until next time, Grief Growers, I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world. And I love you, because even through grief, we are growing.